Firstly, one of the advantages of these distance events means that you are unlikely to catch my cold. So I apologise for me growling into the screen. It's partly from shouting at the telly as UK government ministers try to defend their cut to universal credit. But anyway, let's leave them to their conference for today. So I'm really delighted to be with you. As Bill has said, I'm Chris Birt, I'm Associate Director at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for Scotland. And I've been asked to take you through some of the picture of child poverty in Scotland and how we meet the challenge of bringing that down and what kind of role that economic development can play in that process. But I first wanted to start with something which just, I think, demonstrates the importance of this national mission, which both the Cabinet Secretary and Councillor Everson have mentioned. If we go on to the next slide, please. So there's a quote here, which has come from the National Records of Scotland and is clearly written by a statistician, but I think its cold language really makes the point. Males born in the most deprived areas in Scotland can expect 25 fewer years in good health than males born in our least deprived areas. The gap is over 21 years for females. More than 2 decades of life, good life, stolen from people simply because of where they were born. An outrageous position for a country as wealthy as our own. So I just think, you know, these are difficult times. People in local government, like people across the public sector, have been working incredibly hard to react to this pandemic. And the idea of taking on something as big as health inequality and poverty in Scotland, I realise will feel hard, but this is why it's important. If we go into the next slide, please. So on Monday, we published our Poverty in Scotland 2021 report. And partly it was reflecting on the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament's rightful recognition back in 2017 that we needed to do something about this. So they set very challenging child poverty reduction targets to ultimately get relative child poverty rates below 10% by 2030-31. And the Scottish Parliament insisted on interim targets as well to reduce child poverty to below 18% by 2024. But at the minute, about 1 million people in Scotland and almost 250,000 children live in poverty, a rate of about 25%. So we're some way off even that interim target. And what we did in our report on Monday was updated some projections that we'd made as to where we think we'll be as we get towards those targets. And it will probably be minuscule on your screen, but there is a green dot in there somewhere which shows you what we think is the most likely projection. So that's with the doubling of the child payment that the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned, and sadly with the cut to universal credit and working tax credits gone ahead today, that we still think will be 4 percentage points short of our interim targets in 2024. So lots of work to do. We can move on to the next slide, please. So how do we meet these targets? As Bill said at the beginning, in response to the question is, of course we can meet these targets. We have to choose to. We have to make decisions that get us to them. So how do we make that national mission local? And sometimes I've heard people discuss the role of councils. It's to mitigate the impacts of poverty. And don't get me wrong, for council officers up and down the country over the last year, that is what they have been doing in response to the pandemic. Getting food into houses, keeping people's lights on, supporting kids, supporting families where somebody's disabled, doing remarkable things under extremely difficult conditions. So I don't say this lightly, and I don't say this to ignore the significant efforts that people have put in over the pandemic, but local government does have the powers to take on the root causes of poverty in Scotland, and they must be part of that effort. So through things like education, employability, housing, planning, childcare, social care, transport, and of course, economic development, local government holds some of the most important levers to make changes within our communities in Scotland. And of course, are best placed to make some of those decisions due to their knowledge and their proximity to the communities that they serve. But let's not be naive. Of course, national policy and of course, funding decisions, whether from the UK government or the Scottish government, do have an impact. but so do local services. I'm sure many of you wouldn't get out of your beds in the morning if you didn't think the work that you were doing would have an impact in your communities. So, let's seize a challenge and make a change. So if we can move on to the next slide, thanks. I thought it'd be useful just to kind of focus in a bit on how do we really get going on these things. And excuse me, sometimes we talk about things like well-being economies and human rights budgets and equality budgeting and all of these things, and they seem complex and they're difficult, and people are trying to get in. There's a new model and some shiny Gantt chart or whatever to help you think about things. But for me, this is pretty simple. What are our goals? What are we trying to achieve? And do we know whether or not we're doing it? So I think if you look at something like economic development, I would say that the role of economic development is partly to take on poverty. So it should be pointing in that direction, but do we know whether or not it's working? One of the most important tools in that is the data that is available to you. So I'm going to skip through some data here, just as an example of the sort of things that you could look out for in your local area. But councils hold very in-depth data about the communities that they serve, whether it's through your housing, care, employability systems, etc. There's so much rich information in there that can help you make change. And then, as both Sean and Alison have referred to, how are you involving people? How are you involving the third sector? How are you involving local businesses in how you design and deliver your services? That's vital. We can move on to the next slide, please. So what is the position at local level? The End Child Poverty Coalition commissioned Loughborough University recently to look at child poverty levels across local government in Scotland and the UK. They looked at the period between 2014, 15 and right up to just before the pandemic. And child poverty rose in every local government area in Scotland. So there are lots of good efforts going on, but this is the ultimate outcome at the moment. But of course, it varies by local government area. The highest rates we see at the moment are in Glasgow, almost a third, North Ayrshire, Clackmannanshire, East Ayrshire, Dundee, are all just under 30%. Some of the lowest rates we see are in Shetland, East Dunbartonshire, and East Renfrewshire at 16%. But it's worth noting that that 16% is still well off the 10% target in 2030. It's also worth reflecting on the changes. So the highest uplifts we've seen have been in Glasgow at about 5%, Renfrewshire at 4%, and then there's a cluster of different councils that have had about a 3% rise. I've listed a few of them there: Dumfries and Galloway, West Lothian, Borders, and Angus. The smallest changes we've seen are in Aberdeenshire, East Dunbartonshire, and East Renfrewshire. So that's the kind of high level, child poverty rate within each council. But I thought it would just be useful to show you some information that's publicly available that you can get onto yourself. A non-statistician like me can mess about with them, although I screwed up this graph slightly. So you'll see, you get a professional involved if you can. If you could skip on to the next slide. This will be nigh on impossible for you to read probably on your screens. But what you're seeing here is the increase in universal credit claimants by council since the start of the pandemic. There's two columns for each council, one that shows the increase in summer last year and one that shows the increase in summer this year. And the two horizontal lines going across show the Scottish average. So you can see the councils which are poking up above those lines, so have seen higher rates of increase in universal credit claimants over the pandemic, and obviously some that are below. And the peaks that you can see are in places like Edinburgh, Aberdeen City, Aberdeen Shire. East Renfrewshire has increases as well. So this is really important information because it allows people working in those local authorities to think, well, why is that happening? So you might look at Edinburgh and think, well, that's probably because of the tourism sector, retail, hospitality. Those sectors being particularly badly hit by the pandemic. We also know that lots of people work in low-income jobs within those sectors. So it helps you to think, right, what's happening in my local area? And you can also take this data down even further. If we skip on to the next slide, I just took Angus because it had a kind of manageable number of wards. You can break down the increase in universal credit claimants to the ward level. So if you're sitting in Angus Council, you can look at what's happening in those particular things. And so you might be able to see in a particular area If a particular business is closed, you're seeing the impact on how that's moving people onto Social Security. There's loads more data in there. You can look at it and see who's looking for work, who's not working because they've got caring responsibilities or they're ill themselves. And you'll be able to go into each ward in your council area and break down that sort of information. What's it like for men? What's it like for women, for different ages, etc., etc. There's a load of information out there, and I really encourage you to have a look at it. So what to do with that information? If we could skip to the next slide, please. So what role can economic development play? I mean, the biggest risk to poverty at the moment is not being able to work. So I can't remember the exact figure, but it's over 50% of people who are in a household where nobody works are in poverty, and will be very close to the destitution line, not just in poverty. And the barriers are pretty well known, to be honest. I mean, we speak to folk regularly who experience poverty, and to be frank, they get a bit sick of telling us the same things over and over again. But the inability to access work is driven by known barriers: lack of available and affordable childcare, lack of available and affordable transport, a lack of flexibility from employers. We've also seen in-work poverty really spike over the last few years. You know, almost 70% of kids who are in poverty are in a family where somebody is working. So work is not lifting people out of poverty in the same way that it has in the past. And it's similar barriers. It's not just low pay, although low pay is clearly an issue. It's the inability to secure enough hours to get a decent enough income, or to get those hours on a regular or enough basis. So really inflexible working conditions trap people in poverty because you're not able to extend your hours, or maybe you've got to leave work early because your childcare doesn't work around your work. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So what to do? Again, this comes back to the question I posed before I started waffling on about tables, is what is your plan? What are you aiming to change within your communities that will allow people to get into work? And how are you going to know whether or not that works? Are you providing business incentives in the right areas, reducing the need to travel for those who are less likely to be able to afford to do so? Is your employability genuinely offering something designed around the people who need it the most? Both the Cabinet Secretary and Councillor Everson talked about lone parent families. Lone parent families are much more likely to be out of work than other households. How are you supporting them? It's not just about CV writing. It's about how can you provide that wraparound service to them where transport is available, where childcare is available. And how are you working with employers to break down stigma around, say, people who've been out of the labour market for a while because of caring? Do your transport services link communities to work? So often our transport just goes into the centre of towns and cities. It doesn't take you to childcare. It doesn't take you to other care services. That's no use, and it locks women out of employment more than it locks men out of employment. And is your childcare offering genuinely helping those who could work, aren't working at a classic 9 to 5? And even for 9 to 5, childcare finishes at 3 o'clock. You can't do a job until 5 o'clock. And is new social housing built in ways that allow access to job opportunities and the kind of wraparound services that we're talking about? So is there transport? Is there childcare available? If we can move on to the next slide, please. And here I've selected a selection of different quotes that people have given to us in the preparation of various reports, really, which are showing these barriers which people face. There's one there about childcare. There's one there about stigma and trying to access employment. There's one there, I mean, I think this is a classic thing we hear all the time. Lots of support programs require you to attend. And if you don't attend, you might get chucked off them. But if you have a kid who's ill and you don't have family support around you, what are you supposed to do? It's a catch-22 situation for people. And then the last one, again, shows the inflexibility of lots of employment. People going for jobs, they have the skills for jobs, they could do the jobs well, and employers putting up barriers saying, well, you have to work the weekends, and if you can't take a weekend shift, we won't give you a job. That's no use if you're a single parent. So I think we've spoken lots about how we engage with people who are experiencing poverty just now. That's key. We need to design services with and for people. And just to come back to my initial message, meeting these targets is possible, and local government have to play a vital role in doing that. Economic development, yes, is about creating strong economies, creating job opportunities for people, but it can and it should also reduce poverty. It is possible. I know times are hard. I know taking on something as big as this can feel exhausting in light of all the efforts that people have put in over the last 2 years. But I think that I started with at the beginning, those 25 lost years for people are not acceptable in our country, and we've all got to play a part in ending that poverty in Scotland. Thanks very much.